conocí hace ya unos cuantos años, cuando ella era presidenta de la organización Catholics for Choice, que es una organización muy grande que existe en Estados Unidos y en otras partes del mundo, pero sobre todo está basada en Estados Unidos, y aboga por el derecho de las mujeres a decidir sobre su propio cuerpo dentro de la propia Iglesia Católica. Obviamente no quiere decir eso que en el Vaticano estén muy contentos con ellas, pero ellas así han hecho su trabajo, ellas y ellos, porque la ventaja en inglés Catholics es para católicas y católicos, y de hecho el actual presidente es un hombre de Catholics, pero en América Latina hay muchas organizaciones, aquí ya les van a repartir los textos. En América Latina hay muchas organizaciones que se han desprendido de Catholics for Choice y que tienen el nombre Católicas por el Derecho a Decidir. Ustedes probablemente conocen algunas en sus países en América Latina. Y Frances Kissling se ha dedicado, después de haber dejado la presidencia de Catholics for Choice, a ser consejera de muchas organizaciones no gubernamentales, organizaciones civiles en Estados Unidos y en Europa, haciendo un trabajo particularmente importante actualmente en África. Y actualmente Frances Kissling es profesora de bioética en la Universidad de Pensilvania. Así que, pues sin más, le voy a dar la palabra a la profesora Frances Kissling para su conferencia magistral. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you for warning everybody that I would be speaking in English. I was planning on doing the usual apologies, but now I don't have to do so much apologizing because you just said that's what we're going to do. This presentation started out with the idea, and I do hope that most of you are able to understand me in English. You have a copy of my paper in Spanish, but I am not going to just read from the paper. If I just read from the paper, you might as well go out and have a cup of coffee and read the paper tonight or tomorrow or never. But so if you have me here, there should be a little life to what I have to say, not just reading. Roberto did neglect to mention one of my honors, which is very important to me, and that is that People magazine in the United States, during one of the visits of the Pope, the last Pope, declared me to be one of the 12 people the Pope did not want to meet. So, and since I did not want to meet him, you could say we had a mutual agreement on that subject. So I'm going to talk specifically about the lay state, but in relation most specifically to certain aspects of the Roman Catholic Church's involvement in the UN, in the United States. I want to deal with those two topics. And probably, if I don't run over time, there are a few comments I would like to make about the new Pope. I mean, how can you talk about Catholicism and not talk about the big guy? So I will have a few things to say about the big guy and the lay state, what he means for it. The theme of today is the theme of sexuality, and I would add to that theme the theme of gender, not just because women are sexual, most of us are sexual, but because in terms of the work of establishing lay states and ensuring separation between church, temple, mosque, and state, in the modern era, I think no one has more to gain from this separation than women. The nature of politics now is that this separation between the personal and the public has also eroded. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago, matters of sexuality and matters of even women's rights were not central concerns of government. They have become issues only in this era. I remember being in Beijing at the Women's Conference in 1995, observing the workings of the official UN meeting and seeing at a women's conference a table of mostly men who were placed in the profoundly uncomfortable position of discussing sexual rights. The UN was not used to discussing sexual rights. Reproductive rights itself was difficult for the UN to discuss, and women's rights as well. But these advances in society have pushed issues of sexuality and issues of women's status, and certainly issues of reproduction, particularly access to contraception and to abortion, into the public arena. My own view is that when these issues were not public policy issues, my church, the Roman Catholic Church, was largely silent in the public arena. For example, colleagues of mine ran a very large clandestine abortion clinic in Bogota, Colombia, directly across the street from the cathedral. Nobody bothered them. In fact, the clinic was often solicited by the cathedral for contributions to the good work that the cathedral did, and the clinic complied. It is only when certain sexual and reproductive matters become legal that the institutional church becomes active on those issues. The approval of the state of divorce, contraception, abortion, etc., activates the institution to engage in politics on this issue. The approval of the state constitutes approval. The law is in part a teacher, and that which is legal comes to be seen as that which is moral. And so the church then feels it has a very high stake in these issues. Some of the things that we have seen in the last years in relation to intervention by states, and I do want to at least start by talking a little bit about more than the Roman Catholic Church. What are the issues that are coming up? And these issues come up in almost every country and in every religion. Most predominantly in Roman Catholicism and in Islam, but also in Buddhism, Hinduism, evangelical Christianity, and to some extent in Judaism as well. Questions in Judaism regarding the right of women to get divorced are state issues. In Islam, we see the efforts around custody of children, the ability of women to decide whether their children can leave the country or not leave the country, requiring husband's permission, whereas in the opposite sense, there is no requirement that a husband needs his wife's permission to take the children out of the country. We see inequality in terms of distribution of inheritance that is written into law. And we see even in non-Islamic states, Canada, for example, the UK, even in certain states in the United States, there have been suggestions that Muslims should be able to go to Sharia courts, religious courts, to solve disputes related to the family, that these disputes should not be resolved through the normal judicial system, that Muslim women should be denied, in essence, access to the courts, but should go to a religious court, and that the state should then honor those agreements that are made. Canada, for example, very seriously considered allowing such separate courts for Muslims with much, and it was part of the thrust towards multiculturalism. We all want to be multicultural, we want to respect everybody has a different culture, how can we be friendly to everybody? So let's be friendly to Islam and at the same time be discriminatory to women. So that comes into play. You see even and there are countries such as India, where indeed there are different courts for Muslims, Hindus, and Christians, and we also see the enormous turmoil around religion in those places. But we pay a lot of attention, and we're most aware, or tend to be particularly aware, of some of the actions of the Roman Catholic Church. I'm going to speak I'm going to speak mostly in the present, in the sense of the UN, or at least in the recent past. The Roman Catholic Church, as you probably all know, has a unique status among religions and states in the United Nations. It is considered a non-member permanent observer state. Okay. The only other current holder of that status is Palestine. Prior holder of that status was Switzerland, which decided to become a full member. The recognition of the Vatican as a state within the UN was not a foregone conclusion. Earlier, when the League of Nations was founded, the Vatican sought to become a member of the League of Nations and was rebuffed. The United States opposed its membership in the League of Nations. The League of Nations itself decided that it did not meet the criteria for membership, and so it was not a member of that institution. It became a non-member state in the UN by accident. There was no process in play. There was no approval by the UN in a formal sense of it joining as a non-member state. It simply announced to the Secretary General by letter that it was establishing a mission. And at that time, the Secretary General was Uttant, and Uttant graciously welcomed them into the UN in the category non-member state. The UN had always felt that, or felt at the time that the Vatican joined them, that having the Vatican's approval and participation in the UN, particularly on issues of peace, was of value to the credibility of the United Nations. And it proceeded to hold this status of non-member state without conflict, and with very little controversy, and no one calling attention to it, until the 1980s, and more dominantly in the 1990s. No other religion holds that status, although many other religions have offices in the UN and participate as members of civil society in the same way as CARE or Catholics for Choice participates as an NGO. And many religious organizations have been very helpful in the UN. The Quakers are noted, for example, within the United Nations for having been extremely helpful in terms of many dialogic processes between countries. But the Vatican came to the attention of particularly women's organizations in 1992 at the Rio Conference on the environment. This was when, in essence, the Vatican began to push an agenda within the UN to ensure that on the first round, that the question of population and the need for family planning and access, although at that point access to abortion was not on the UN's agenda, but the need for family planning was an important element in the environmental agenda. That if we are going to save the environment, if we are going to conserve resources, if we are going to overcome poverty, one of the elements in that agenda is making contraception available to women and men who want it. And so in Rio, the Vatican was a very strong opponent to the inclusion of population at all in the agenda, but not out of what would be seen as a left agenda. There are many of us who are opposed to population control or to using population as an excuse, the reduction of population as an excuse for not dealing with environmental problems, not calling corporations to accountability, and not doing the kind of economic development that is necessary to lift people out of poverty, but in essence, using women who are more manipulatable than corporations, and getting them to have fewer babies. So the difference in agenda here. The agenda here was not population. The agenda here was to stall the approval of family planning. This put many countries, the European Union and the United States at that time, favorable to these issues, and the UN on notice that when we came to the 1994 Conference on Population at Cairo, Population and Development at Cairo, we were likely to see a much stronger initiative by the Vatican as a state to limit the kind of progress that could be made on sexual and reproductive health. And indeed, that is what happened. Because of what the Vatican participates in conferences with full voting status, does not participate in the General Assembly with full voting status, but in special conferences it is treated no different than Haiti, Mexico, the United States. And so it can really do a considerable amount of good or damage depending on what it wants to pursue in that forum. And in the Forum of Cairo, it had a number of agendas that were critical to women's rights and to reproductive rights. It tried very hard to block language in the outcome document that said individuals and couples have a right to contraception. It did not want individuals to have that right, only couples. And of course, if it could have only married couples. It was active in preventing any recognition, obviously, of abortion and the only way in which the UN was prepared to deal with abortion at that point in time was as a matter of public health or safety, that women should have access to safe abortion. Women should not die in abortion. And so it was very active in preventing any advancement on a UN agenda or UN and state approval of the right to choose abortion. It was, of course, completely opposed to adolescent rights, to confidential services. One of the delegates, I can't remember from which country, when this was being discussed, got up and tried to, and asked the representative of the Holy See, why would it be that adolescents were entitled to confidentiality in the confessional, but not entitled to confidentiality in medical matters? So there was much resistance on the part of many states to this, but there was also clearly, while the Vatican did not have the power to rule the outcome of the document, what it had the power to do was to stall progress, because one ended up with a much watered down document. This kind of work on the part of the Vatican went further when we got to the Women's Conference, where the Vatican then was opposed to any recognition of women's rights as human rights. Women's rights are not human rights. And to so articulate is to be creating new human rights. We should not be about creating new human rights. The general rubric used by the Vatican, or language used by the Vatican, is to recognize women's dignity, but not women's rights. And of course, it was at the Beijing conference that there was, for the first time, the UN began to deal with sexuality. And the Vatican, again, in consultation or in collaboration with the Central American states, which have very often sided with the Vatican in these debates, and with some of the Muslim states, very much opposed any recognition of the concept of sexual health or sexual rights, that these were not appropriate matters for government, for the UN to be dealing with. Now, women observing these two meetings, women were really, women woke up to, you know, what is the Vatican doing in the United Nations? How did this status come about? And began to organize an effort which was called the Sea Change Campaign, SEE for Holy See, to change the status of the Vatican in the UN. It was an effort that was valiant, at times amusing, but really actually ended up in giving the Vatican more power within the UN. Because the Vatican then went to friendly countries and sought greater rights within the UN and got them. So that the Vatican now has, it still cannot vote in the General Assembly, but it does have the right now to distribute materials, to mount statements and resolutions, things that it did not have before. The interesting thing that those of us as women, and I think as many people think about in relation to this, is why is it, whether we are talking about the Vatican, the UN, or whether we are talking about countries who respond to pressure around sexual issues or reproductive health issues or women's issues from the Vatican or from conservative religionists in general, why is it that the state is so much more afraid of challenging or of denying religious institutions access to what they want in terms of government? Why is it that liberal voices, or voices for the lay state, or voices for sexual rights are ignored by the state, but the Vatican or the Organization of Islamic Conference, or whatever entity we want to speak of, is treated by government with fear? We saw, those of us who worked in the UN definitely saw this. The UN was, to put it mildly, freaked out by the presence of conservative religious NGOs in the halls of the UN. They were freaked out by marginal groups, NGO religious groups, who would put out a press release criticizing the Vatican. And in conversations with those of us who worked closely within the UN, the message was not to antagonize those groups, that we can't push these issues further because of the presence of the Vatican within the UN. For the Vatican, why is it important for the Vatican? What is it that the Vatican gets out of being a member of the UN? Why, and I see the UN as a state actor, the Vatican as a non-state actor. Why is it important for the Vatican to consistently have diplomatic relationships with countries and to be recognized as a state within bodies like the UN, to be active within WHO. I mean, the Vatican's activities within the international arena are enormous. I mean, in WHO General Assemblies, the Vatican is a member, gets to vote on health issues, provides the same kind of obstacle to women's rights, to sexual health, to condoms for HIV prevention, all of the things that we know about. And clearly, I would say the importance is, or at least the way in which the Vatican looked at its memberships in these various institutions and described it themselves, is their vision of themselves, their vision of a modern world in which the things they valued and believed in were being left behind. And so to push for what they would saw as a countercultural beacon within those institutions was important. And given the Vatican's predominant interest in developing countries at this stage, I mean, it has written off the United States, it has written off Europe, is primarily interested in developing the church further in Africa, Asia, and to some extent in Latin America. And therefore, the UN is an agency whose decisions are taken seriously in countries in Africa or in countries in Asia. They're not taken seriously by the United States or by Europe particularly, but in those other countries they are taken seriously. So if you want to prevent things from happening at the state level, the country level, then preventing them from happening in the UN is an important element of that. I want to turn now to the United States and what is going on currently. I'm sure everybody here is very aware of the kinds of conflicts over church and state that have existed in the United States, and the perhaps fragility of the First Amendment to the US Constitution, which requires that, you know, we will not establish any religion, but we will not prevent any religion from functioning within our society. This has been, in the modern era, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the First Amendment was treated quite strictly by the government. So efforts of the expansion of religion into the state were rebuffed by the courts. School prayer is not permitted, was not permitted. Government monies being spent on primary Catholic education or any religious education was also not permitted. And in general, the line between church and state was strongly kept. With Ronald Reagan's entry into the presidency, this began to shift. It shifted for several reasons. First of all, it shifted because both parties, but first the Republican Party, needed to build a political base that was stronger than the base they currently had. The Republicans decided that in addition to Christian evangelicals, they needed to go after the Catholic vote. They had never gotten the Catholic vote. And so a friendlier approach to the Catholic Church came into play, and a very friendly approach to evangelical Christian churches as well. It was, in fact, Ronald Reagan who gave diplomatic recognition to the Vatican. Up to that point in time, the Vatican was not recognized as a state, and we did not exchange ambassadors. So that was also something that was seen as something you give to the church. Now, since the 1980s, we have seen increasing incursions in terms of, primarily in terms of public and governmental support for religion in a variety of ways. In some cases, and particularly it's interesting because I want to talk about the healthcare reform in the United States and what is going on relative to sexual and reproductive rights within healthcare reform, the Catholic Church in particular, and the government. But what happened in that period, in the 60s, what actually happened was that Catholic hospitals and Catholic universities wanted to receive government money. and they couldn't receive government money because they were Catholic. And so what they entered into was a process of disinvestment. They separated themselves formally from the Catholic Church. They developed secular boards of directors. They incorporated as educational or health institutions, but not under the auspices of the Catholic Church. And as a result, they became able to receive very substantial amounts of public money. And this went on with nobody having much of a problem with this until issues of sexuality and reproduction became dominant, again, within our sense of public health. And so the most current incursion, which has been quite interesting, has related to the Affordable Care Act, or which you probably all know as Obamacare. A decision was reached by the US government after study by our Institute of Medicine. The Institute of Medicine decided that the preventive package within insurance plans in the United States must include contraception, must include all FDA-approved contraceptives, contraceptive sterilization, and emergency contraception. And that all insurance plans needed to do this. And the rationale for this was a public health need. We have an enormous problem of unintended pregnancy. We have a very high rate of abortion. And we also have a very high rate of unintended births. And as a result, we have enormous health problems related to not just abortion, but children who are born in families where they cannot be cared for. So preventing unintended pregnancy is an important public health measure. That was the rationale. In addition to this, because we do make exceptions, religious exceptions in the United States, we had to decide as a country what was a religious employer? Who was a religious employer? Because only religious employers would be exempt from insuring women and men for contraception. And a very narrow definition of a religious employer was developed by the government. There were 4 criteria to require for the religious exemption. The function of the entity seeking the exemption needed to be the inculcation of religion. The employees of the entity needed to be primarily members of that religion, and the people served by the entity needed to be members of the religion. And the 4th requirement was a technical one. It needed to be considered a tax-exempt institution under the laws of the United States. Immediately, the Catholic bishops, the Catholic hospitals, and the Catholic universities and the Catholic social service agencies were up in arms, because the only people who met that test were the bishops, your parish church, and your parish school, if your parish had a school. A hospital or a university did not meet this test. And the majority of institutions that consider themselves Catholics are hospitals, universities, and social service agencies. And they were not going to be exempt from this requirement. The reality is they complained on 2 grounds. They said it would violate their conscience to provide contraception. And that became the major public issue. Although the fact of the matter was that most of these entities were already providing coverage for contraception in their current insurance plans. Many of them had been required to do it by the state in which they were located. They fought against it, they lost, and they complied. But now this became a big issue. And the reason it became a big issue, and I talked with several leaders in this field about this, is not because of the contraceptive requirement. It was because of the definition of what was a religious organization. that to narrow religion, in their mind, to narrow religion down to worship only was disturbing. And you can see this in many of the discussions about the lay state. The controversy is over this question of whether you are going to keep religion in a box inside the church. You know, that proponents to some extent of the lay state are, you know, what you want to do in your church building is your business. But what religions want to say is, look, that's what the Catholic Church says, look, we provide health care as part of our religious mission. The definition of religion as narrowed to worship is not accepted by religion. You know, Jesus said, heal, you know, take care of the sick, feed the hungry, visit the imprisoned. When we do those things, we are doing them as a religion, and therefore we deserve a religious exemption. And so this battle has gone on for 2 years now in the United States. It is definitely a challenge to the lay nature, to the extent the United States has a lay nature, and to the extent anybody has a lay nature. It's definitely a challenge to lay nature because it will definitively deny services to significant numbers of women who seek services and who are employed within those institutions that are currently not defined as a religion. And so the battle has gone on for 2 years. A variety of accommodations have been made by the government. The accommodations do not include an explicit rejection of the definition of religion, but it is somehow less dominant. You know, it's down in a footnote somewhere now instead of up in the document. And but there are still 80 lawsuits that have been filed by religious and corporate entities in the United States to get out of complying with this mandate. And these lawsuits go further than anything we have seen in terms of the idea of exemption. This is ultimately, we're calling this an exemption, but ultimately this is a challenge to what would be called the right to conscientious objection. What really is conscientious objection in a religious context? So religious institutions have filed suits that are all on their way to the Supreme Court. But interestingly enough, I think the largest challenge comes from corporations. Several secular entities, one of the best known in the US is called Hobby Shop. This is a company that sells toys and things for your hobbies and knitting and all that kind of stuff. And because the employer is himself religious, he says he has a right not to be required to violate his conscience by providing these devices, this insurance to women. And right now, that we have had different decisions on some of these corporate cases, with some courts siding with the corporations and some courts against them. And so this too will be an issue that needs to be decided by the courts. And the courts may well, we are not confident that the lay arguments will prevail in these cases. We are simply not confident. So the expansion of conscience protection in the United States, particularly around, and most conscience protection that people want is for things related to HIV, contraception, IVF, assisted reproduction, abortion, those issues that are central to women's health and central to sexual health. So what has developed, and I want to do this extremely quickly because I only have about 5 more minutes left on this. I think one of the things that has not been particularly paid attention to has been the development of what you might consider to be a women's or feminist wing of the lay state movement. Many organizations have sprung up of women around the world who are now working specifically on the question of lay state. So, for example, in Malaysia, you have a global movement, an Arab state movement to the most part, but a global movement called Musawa. Musawa means equality, and this movement is a challenge to family law under Islam. You have, I want to turn to my paper so I don't forget some of the names. I know there's a group now is there a group now in Mexico, Maria, on lay state that is dominantly the result of stuff related to women? Well, Católicas, but also others. Okay. In the
I would say most feminist groups are related to
the lay state now.
Lay state now,
Yeah, that the understanding of women's groups that challenges to the lay state challenge them. In the United States, we have something that's been formed called the Coalition for Liberty and Justice, which is an alliance of faith-based and secular groups, predominantly concerned with matters of women's rights and matters of reproductive health and reproductive rights. Also, there is a global interfaith and secular alliance, also organized out of Malaysia, but again, region-wide, that is working again on questions related to church and state. And an international organization, the Association for Women's Rights in Development, has had a project on religious fundamentalism, where it is involved in studying religious fundamentalism and researching and monitoring violations of religious liberty and freedom, particularly related to women over the years. My own view is that the lay movement, the lay state movement, really would find considerable vitality added to its own movement if closer links between the lay state organizations and academics were made in terms of pushing this issue forward. So I think that would be important. I'm going to close with just a few words about what might Pope Francis mean for lay state relations. There's been an enormous public positive reaction to the Pope. People like him. Okay, they like him. And we haven't liked, whether you're Catholic or non-Catholic, not too many people have liked the two previous popes. They're not likable guys. And being likable is an important quality in life. You actually get farther being likable than smart. But in most cases, and to be likable and smart, what could be better? You really are in that way. But so people like this Pope. What is it that they like about him? And does it matter? Does what they like about him matter? And you have 2 points. You have 75 points of view. There's the it doesn't matter point of view. It's just all good PR. He hired good PR people, and he's just trying to calm the waters and make things nice, make the church more popular. But nothing is going to change. He's the same as the ones before. And to tell you the truth, I am a person who prefers no pope. I think that no pope is better than any pope. But since I have to live with a pope, I have to look at it in a slightly different way, or else I have to become something else. And I think that actually the Pope holds great promise for a more tolerant church. We're not, anybody who expects women priests next year, even married men priests next year, and certainly anybody who expects the position on abortion to change, is going to be deeply disappointed. They are going to say this pope is the same as all the other popes. There are some areas where I do think things, so-called doctrine will change. I think we will see married men priests if this pope is pope for 10 years. And I think after we see married men, because married men priests within our own doctrine are permissible, it's just a matter of discipline that we don't have them. And once we have married men priests having sex with women, and women getting pregnant, birth control will be a sacrament. We will see a change in the position on birth control. It will be understood as the necessity it is for a healthy life. But what I do see with this pope is first of all, he's been nice to everybody except the bishops and the priests. Now that's pretty interesting, all right? I mean, so he's not like universally nice. He is picking on the bishops and the priests. And he is pointing them in a number of different directions. He's pointing them toward poverty, eradicating poverty, towards eradicating poverty. That's what he's pointing them towards. He's pointing them towards a personal lifestyle that is less outrageous. The mansions, the limousines, and he's doing this both in how he talks about this and in how he lives. He also has said things that you don't normally hear that are very important, like, we made mistakes. We have been wrong. And he hasn't just pointed to Galileo. He's acknowledging error on a broader kind of a level. And that that there are things we don't know. Okay. That kind of thinking, and I don't have time to go into detail with many more examples. If we were to get a Roman Catholic Church that changed none of its internal positions, which is a matter between the Roman Catholic Church and the people who choose to belong to it. Inside the church, we can fight if we want, leave if we want, obey if we want. But it doesn't affect our legal rights or the rights of others. So if this pope, first of all, takes this visionary approach, and I think this is very important. Essentially, what we have had are popes in the recent past who concentrate on the rules. This is a church of rules. And the rules are not bendable or mediated through the life experience of human beings. This is a pope who seems more interested in the life experience of human beings than the rules. He's not overturning the rules. He's not bothering with that. But he's concentrating on how people live their lives. So, for example, when he was asked about Humanae Vitae, will you change Humanae Vitae? His response was, well, no, we're not going to change Humanae Vitae. This is how the church works anyway. We're not going to change Humanae Vitae, but perhaps we haven't interpreted it well. And that's, I think, what you can get for internal church life. And for external church life, if you can get a church that has the tolerance and respect that he seems to be preaching to the rest of the world, with more tolerance of difference within the state, I think that's about the best you're going to get out of the Catholic Church. And it would certainly be extremely helpful. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your attention to someone who comes to a Spanish language conference and chatters away in English. And I hope that it was helpful for your process for the rest of the day and forward. I want to finally recommend, he didn't ask me to do this wonderful new book edited by Roberto on laicidad, religión y biopolítica en el mundo contemporáneo.
Exacto. Que termina con un texto de Francis Kissling acerca de la política norteamericana de Obama respecto a derechos sexuales y reproductivos, y es muy interesante. Antes de darle las gracias a Francis, quisiera recordar una cosa que se me olvidé que quería decir en la presentación, que además de que lo que ahora ya quedó demostrado, su agudeza y su inteligencia, Francis une a eso una labor muy importante de militancia en todos estos temas. Y no sé si ustedes habrán visto las noticias hace un mes o dos, cuando mucho, acerca de una serie de observaciones que después, finalmente, después de muchos años, Naciones Unidas le hizo a la Santa Sede como miembro participante en la Comisión de Derechos Humanos, en la subcomisión de la niñez. Bueno, todo eso que finalmente sucedió en el 2014 y por lo cual se está quejando muchísimo la Santa Sede, que cómo se atreven a decirle las cosas mal que ha hecho para proteger los derechos de los niños, entre otras cosas fue iniciado por Francis, que hace, para que vean cómo funciona esto en Naciones Unidas, hace como 12 años me invitó, fuimos un grupo de personas que teníamos que ver con el tema y muchas víctimas de los sacerdotes, de la pederastia de los sacerdotes y otro tipo de víctimas de abusos de la iglesia. Y fuimos por ahí, si no mal recuerdo, en 2002 a la subcomisión de la niñez de la Comisión de Derechos Humanos de Naciones Unidas a exigirle a la comisión que precisamente hiciera algo y le exigiera algo a la Santa Sede, ya que una vez que es participante y que no la vamos a sacar como participante de Naciones Unidas, bueno, que rinda cuentas por lo menos. Y quiero decir esto como un homenaje a los esfuerzos que Francis hizo, porque si 12 años después finalmente la comisión le exigió y le está exigiendo que responda a la Santa Sede, es gracias a ese tipo de esfuerzos. Y pues con eso le agradezco nuevamente por la plática, Francis.
Perhaps if the Vatican is held accountable in the UN, it might decide it's not in its interest to be a member.
Exacto. Muy bien. You keep that one.
Oh, thank you so much. Was that okay?
Oh, very good. Yes.